They said no woman could hold the eastern ridge alone. When the enemy launched the first assault at dawn, Sergeant Elena Voss was already bleeding from a shoulder wound. The second wave came with armored vehicles. The third came with flamethrowers and drones. Command had ordered a retreat, but Elena refused to abandon the trapped medics behind enemy lines. As soldiers twice her size broke under pressure, the female sniper crawled through smoke, ice, and gunfire, turning one rifle into an entire defense line. By sunrise, 3 assault waves had fallen, and the enemy commander, sitting in his command tent miles away, demanded only one thing from his officers: find the woman on the ridge. The Karvash Range in late November was not a place that forgave mistakes. Snow packed the rock faces in thick, blue-gray sheets, and the wind came off the upper slopes in long, low howls that men compared to the sound of something grieving. The eastern ridge, the soldiers had taken to calling it simply the ridge, sat at an elevation where the air was thin enough to make your lungs ache and your aim drift if you forgot to compensate. 3 sides dropped off into ravines so steep and ice-choked that even supply drones struggled to navigate them. The 4th side faced the valley floor, where the enemy had been massing for the better part of 2 days. It was, by every tactical measure, a position that should not be held by one platoon. And yet, on the morning of the 23rd, that was exactly what Sergeant Elena Voss and 11 others had been ordered to do: hold the ridge until reinforcements could push through from the western approach, a timeline that command estimated at somewhere between 12 and 48 hours. In the mountains, that kind of estimate was another word for prayer. Lieutenant Marcus Hale had been the one to hand down the order, and he had not done it with particular confidence. He was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-30s who had come up through the conventional infantry track and carried with him the particular skepticism of someone who believed that war was a matter of physical mass aggression. He had looked at Elena when he delivered the briefing, really looked at her, the way men sometimes did when they were trying to figure out where a woman fit into a calculation that had never been designed to include one, and said, with a flatness that was somehow worse than open hostility, "Voss, I need you to understand what I'm telling you. That position is going to take everything we have. You cannot hold that ridge alone." Elena had not responded to the first part of that sentence. She had simply looked at the map, at the contour lines that told the story of the terrain better than any words could, and said, "Who else are you sending?" Hale had paused, then named 10 names. She had recognized 8 of them. The other 2 were recent transfers, young, in their early 20s, barely past basic. She had nodded once and said, "When do we move?" Hale had watched her for a moment longer than necessary, then looked away. There were others in the platoon who were less restrained in their doubts. Private First Class Devin Marsh, a 22-year-old from somewhere flat and agricultural in the Midwest, had made his feelings known with the casual cruelty of someone who did not yet understand consequences. He had said it in passing, to another soldier, but loudly enough for half the staging area to hear. "Command must be running low if they're sending us up there with a female sniper." The other soldier, Corporal Ray Gutierrez, a quieter man who kept mostly to himself, had said nothing in response. Elena had heard it, and done what she almost always did with that kind of noise. She had filed it somewhere low and cold inside herself and moved on. She had heard variations of that sentence for nearly 6 years. It no longer had the power to surprise her. What it did, instead, was clarify something. It sharpened the part of her that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with precision. Because the truth about Elena Voss, the part that was not visible in her frame or her rank insignia, or the fact of her gender, was a record that sat in classified files and the memories of people who had been in places rarely talked about. She had been the most decorated sniper in her unit before the Mirova incident. She had operated in 4 different mountain theaters, had held positions that other shooters had deemed untenable, and had accumulated a record of confirmed shots that put her in a category of perhaps a dozen active military snipers on Earth. Then Mirova had happened. A mission in the high passes east of a town that no longer appeared on current maps, a sequence of decisions and miscalculations, and a communication failure that had ended with 3 of her teammates dead and Elena alive, crawling out of the snow under fire with 2 others who would spend the rest of their lives trying not to think about what they had seen. Command had cleared her of wrongdoing in the formal review, but clearing and forgiving were different things, and Elena had not been returned to frontline sniper operations. She had been given a secondary role: support, assessment, specialized consultation, until the Karvash offensive had stretched the roster thin enough that someone had looked at her file and decided the circumstances required her particular skill set. She had not argued. She had packed her rifle and her kit, and gotten on the transport, and not said a word about what it meant to be going back. She kept a photograph in the inside breast pocket of her jacket. It was small, worn soft at the edges from handling, and showed 8 people standing in front of a vehicle in a landscape that looked like the surface of something not quite earth-gray and cold and without mercy. 3 of the 8 people in that photograph were gone. Elena touched it sometimes, briefly, the way other people touched a bruise they were not sure had fully healed. She touched it on the transport up to the ridge, and then put her hand back on her rifle and looked out the window at the snow. The enemy signal appeared in the pre-dawn dark, just as the temperature dropped to its lowest point and the fog thickened along the valley floor until the world below the ridge was nothing but a gray ceiling. Elena had been at her position for 40 minutes, lying flat on a shelf of rock she had identified as the optimal sighting line within 10 minutes of arriving on station. She had her scope adjusted for the elevation, the temperature, and the expected wind shift that always came through the Karvash passes at first light. She had been watching the fog below and calculating, and then the signals came, not radio, which the enemy knew was being monitored, but light signals, brief and coded, passing between points in the darkness below that were just far enough apart to suggest a coordinated line advance rather than a probe. She pressed her earpiece and said, quietly, to the 2 soldiers nearest her position, "Wake the others. They're moving." There was a pause on the other end, and then the sound of boots on frozen ground. The first assault began at the moment the sky shifted from black to gray-blue, that flat, colorless dawn that sits before actual light and turns everything into silhouette. They came up the south face, which was the gentler slope and therefore the expected approach, in a line that Elena estimated at somewhere between 40 and 60 combatants spread across a 200-meter front. The men on the ridge saw them at roughly the same moment, and the reaction was what Elena had anticipated, a surge of noise and movement that in some soldiers looked like preparation and in others looked a great deal like the beginning of panic. Devon Marsh's voice was audible above the rest, not in words but in pitch, a register that had risen perceptibly from where it had been the night before. Corporal Gutierrez was steadier. He got to his firing position without being told, and began confirming targets to his left. Elena did not rush. That was the thing that distinguished her from shooters with good mechanics, but not great understanding, the absolute refusal to allow the urgency of a situation to compress her process. She lay behind the rifle and breathed and measured. Distance to the lead element, approximately 420 meters. Wind, at that moment, running roughly 12 kilometers per hour from the northwest, which would push around slightly right at that range. Temperature affecting muzzle velocity. She made the adjustments without conscious arithmetic. Her body had internalized the math over thousands of hours until it operated below the level of thought. She identified the machine gun team first. They were in the left third of the advancing line, moving with purpose, 1 man carrying the weapon and another with the ammunition feed. A machine gun established on the ridge approach would change the geometry of the entire defense. She took it away in 2 shots, the gunner first, then the assistant before he could reach the weapon. The sound of the rifle in the frozen air was enormous and flat and final. The line below hesitated. She moved to the second priority target before the echo had finished crossing the ravine. The communications specialist, identifiable by the equipment profile on his back and his position slightly behind the main advance, went down with 1 shot. Without communications coordination, the assault line would become reactive rather than directed, forced to operate on visual signals alone and therefore slower to adapt. Then the demolitions man, the one who had been moving toward the outer defensive wire with a cutting tool in his hand, because an intact wire line bought the defenders time they could not afford to give away. 3 shots. 3 targets. The line below stopped advancing. It did not retreat, but it stopped, and in a firefight, stopping is a form of conceding. Private First Class Rourke, one of the 2 young transfers, a 19-year-old named Tommy Rourke, who had the wide, watchful eyes of someone absorbing everything around him at maximum speed, had been positioned 6 meters to Elena's left. He was firing, not badly for his experience level, but he was watching her more than he was watching his sector. She said, without looking at him, "Your left quadrant," and he snapped his attention back, but she saw, in that brief glance, that something in his expression had changed from the look he had worn the previous night when she had caught him explaining to another private that female snipers were a morale problem. The look he had now was different. She filed that too, in a different compartment than she had filed Devon Marsh's voice. The enemy assault broke at roughly the 45-minute mark, not a rout, but a withdrawal under fire, pulling back to the tree line below the south face with casualties that Elena estimated at between 14 and 19 from the sniper position alone, with additional losses from the other defenders. The ridge fell into a relative quiet that was not peace. It was the silence of a machine that had paused between cycles. Elena reloaded and counted what she had left. The number was not good. She had expended more rounds than she preferred in the first engagement, in part because some of the ground-level defenders had required her to engage targets that a better resourced position would have handled with other weapons. She looked at the sky, where the gray-blue was brightening slowly toward white, and saw the first drone, small, quadrotor, moving in a holding pattern above the southern approach. Reconnaissance. She watched it for a moment, then looked at Gutierrez. "They're assessing," she said. He nodded. They both knew what came after assessing. In the brief interval between the first withdrawal and whatever came next, the men of the Ridge Defense talked about Elena Voss, in the way that soldiers talk about things they do not have language for yet obliquely, in fragments, using the grammar of humor and deflection because direct acknowledgement felt too large. Devon Marsh was quieter than he had been the previous night. He had watched the first assault from a forward position and he had seen, with his own eyes, the sequence of shots that had dismantled the enemy advance at its critical points, not suppressive fire, not area fire, but surgical, purposeful, specific shots that had removed exactly the elements of the attack that needed to be removed. He said nothing, but he helped distribute the remaining ammunition without being asked, which was a different kind of statement. Ray Gutierrez cleaned his weapon and did not say anything about Elena directly. What he said, to Tommy Rourke, was, "You watch how she selects targets. Not who's closest. Not who's most visible. Who matters." Rourke said he understood. Gutierrez said, "You will." The flashback, when it came to Elena, came the way it always did, not as a dramatic intrusion but as a quiet overlay, a second image beneath the surface of what she was actually seeing. She was looking at the valley below, at the tree line where the enemy had withdrawn, and she was also seeing the Mirova Pass at night, the particular texture of the snow under starlight, the radio static that had preceded the silence, that had preceded the sound of men dying in positions they had not known were compromised. She had made 2 calls at Mirova, both correct by any objective analysis of the information available to her at the time, and one of them had been wrong in a way that could only be known afterward. Marcus Webb, 26 years old, from a city in the Northwest, who had sent her a photograph of his daughter a week before the mission, had died in a position that Elena had assessed as secure. She had assessed it as secure because the information she had been given was wrong. She had known, in the cold aftermath, that the error was systemic and not personal. She had known that it was not her fault in any meaningful sense. She had never been able to make herself believe it. The brace of soldiers who had begun to drift toward the northwestern edge of the ridge position, not fleeing, exactly, but testing the line between holding and not holding, was something Elena noticed and addressed without drama. She did not raise her voice. She said, to the 2 men who were moving in that direction, "That slope is exposed to drone observation from the eastern approach. You'll be targeted within 30 seconds of clearing the ridgeline." They stopped. They came back. She did not comment on the reason they had been moving that way in the first place. There was no utility in it. The command transmission came through on a frequency that was still partially functional, crackling and intermittent. If the ridge could not be held, retreat was authorized. Elena listened to it, acknowledged receipt, and looked back at the medical station that had been established in a sheltered depression 50 meters behind the main defensive line. There were 11 wounded there, men who had taken injuries in the lead-up to the current action or in the first assault, men who could not be moved without vehicles and helicopters that were not currently available. 2 medics were with them. A retreat order to the able-bodied defenders was, effectively, an abandonment order to everyone in that hollow. Elena clicked off the transmission and did not say anything about it to the others. She went back to her position and began counting ammunition again. The armored vehicles appeared from the northwest, 2 of them, moving along the access track that paralleled the lower ridge, their thermal sensors sweeping in slow arcs ahead of them. They were followed by a second infantry advance, larger than the first, and supported by 2 additional drones operating in a coordinated pattern that made them substantially harder to ignore than the reconnaissance drone had been. The mortar rounds began arriving before the infantry was in visible range, short, probing shots that were walking their way up the south face toward the defensive positions. Elena moved before the 3rd round had landed, relocating 17 meters to her left to a secondary position she had identified during her initial reconnaissance of the ridge. The 4th round hit precisely where she had been lying. She did not think about it. She was already settling into the new position and reacquiring her sight picture. The armored vehicle on the left, she took the driver first, through the vision port, a shot that required waiting for the vehicle to pass through a precise angle relative to her position and that she had been calculating since they appeared. The vehicle lurched and stopped, and the one behind it, following its track, had to brake to avoid a collision. In the confusion, the infantry advance lost momentum. The drone coordinator, the one managing the thermal sweep from a position she had identified by the pattern of its movements, was next. Without coordination, the drones began operating independently, which meant, predictably, she let the left one run its pattern 3 times and then stopped it on the 4th pass. The right one she flagged for Gutierrez, who took it down with a burst that scattered it across the rocky ground below the ridge line. The mortar round stopped for 40 seconds as the fire control team reassessed. Those 40 seconds mattered. The explosion came from her right flank, a secondary charge that had been placed during the first assault and detonated remotely. Something she had not anticipated and that she added, immediately and permanently, to the catalog of things she would never stop second-guessing. The concussive force threw her left shoulder into a rock outcropping, and she felt the damage before she processed it, a deep, tearing sensation that ran from the shoulder joint down through the upper arm, and then, almost immediately, warmth. She had been shot. The angle suggested it had come from the same explosion, a fragment rather than a round. But the distinction was not immediately relevant. She pressed her hand against her shoulder, felt the extent of it, determined it was serious but not immediately incapacitating, and continued firing. Tommy Rourke was beside her within seconds, and she directed him to a target before he could say anything about her shoulder. He engaged the target. Then she let him help her apply a field compress to the wound without stopping her observation of the valley below. "Why haven't you stopped?" he asked. He meant retreated. He meant quit. He was 20 years old, and he was asking a genuine question, not a rhetorical one, genuinely trying to understand the mechanism that kept a person functional under these circumstances. Elena finished adjusting the compress and got back behind the scope. "Because behind us there are people still alive," she said. It was not the whole answer, but it was the part that was currently relevant. Rourke was quiet for a moment, then he went back to his position. The second assault broke at roughly the same point as the first, but the cost had been substantially higher. The ridgeline had taken structural damage from the mortar rounds. 2 of the forward positions were no longer viable, and the defensive perimeter had contracted by approximately 30 meters. More critically, the ammunition situation had moved from concerning to serious. Elena had been precise in her expenditure, and it had still not been enough to preserve comfortable reserves. She redistributed what remained, calculated what she needed for a third engagement, and came up with a number that was just barely possible if her shot selection was perfect. She had never needed perfect before. She had always been very good, which in practice was sufficient. Perfect was a different thing. She looked at the sky, which was now dark, and at the valley below, where lights were beginning to move in patterns that told a clear story about what was coming. The night brought cold that was in a different category than the cold of the day. It moved through clothing and equipment and got into the joints in the mind in a way that had to be actively managed. Elena had khaki wound. She sat with her back against a rock and threaded a field suture through the wound by feel and the light of a shielded torch, while Rourke held the light steady and tried not to look directly at what she was doing. He said, eventually, quietly, the way people say things they have been carrying for long enough that they can no longer justify the weight of them. "I thought women shouldn't be in combat positions." It was not an argument. It was an admission. Elena tied off the suture and checked the tension and said, "A lot of people think that." She was not angry. Anger required energy. She was budgeting carefully. He said, "I was wrong." She did not agree or disagree with the statement. It was sufficiently obvious on its own terms. What she said instead was something her father had told her when she was 12 years old, and had come home crying after a competition she had not won, having expended every visible effort she possessed and still come up short. He had said, "Being calm is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to act despite it. That is the only strength that doesn't run out." She had not known what to do with it at 12. She had understood it completely by the time she was 22. The older soldier Sergeant First Class Harold Burke, 51 years old, had been in more theaters than he could name quickly, and had the particular stillness of a man who had made peace with the arithmetic of war. Came to her with something in his hand. It was a rifle round, standard caliber, with a name inscribed on the casing in the small, careful letters of someone working with a pocket knife. The name was Grace. He held it out to her without explanation. She looked at it, then at him. "My daughter," he said. "She's 8. I thought I'd put it through the last thing that needed stopping, whenever that was." but you're going to need it more than I will tonight." Elena looked at the round for a long moment. Then she took it and put it in her top breast pocket, beside the photograph. "Thank you," she said. Burke went back to his position. Below the ridge, in the darkness of the valley, a line of lights had appeared, dozens of them, moving slowly, systematically, with the deliberate patience of something that was not in a hurry because it did not need to be. The third assault was different in kind, not just in scale. The flamethrower units came first, not to advance, but to deny burning the approach paths in wide arcs that removed cover and turned the snow into steam and reduced visibility on the ridge to something close to nothing. The phasic light from the incendiary rounds and the illumination shells they fired in salvos created a strobing, disorienting environment in which it was nearly impossible to maintain spatial orientation. The drone assault was coordinated and aggressive, not reconnaissance drones but combat-configured units, small and fast, flying in patterns designed to triangulate defensive positions. Elena moved. She moved constantly from one firing point to another, taking shots from positions she had not used before, leaving the positions immediately, and moving laterally before the enemy could process the origin of fire. The technique was one she had developed over years in mountain terrain, and its effect, when executed correctly, was to make the enemy believe they were facing a position defended by multiple snipers rather than one. She counted, roughly, the number of different firing points she had used within the first 20 minutes. 11. From the enemy's perspective, she had created the impression of at least 4 distinct shooters operating in a coordinated pattern. Private Michael Dean, one of the original platoon members, a quiet man who had kept close to Elena throughout the previous engagements without drawing attention to the fact, was covering her left flank when the flamethrower team pushed a secondary probe up through the eastern ravine. He saw them before she did and moved to intercept, and he held them long enough for Elena to reposition. And then the illumination round that came down at precisely the wrong moment found him in the open, and he went down. Elena heard it. She did not look. She could not look because looking would have cost her the sight picture on the target that, if she missed it, would cost the rest of them everything. She took the shot. The target went down. Then she looked. Dean was not moving. The thing that happened inside her then was not grief. Exactly, grief was a long process that required time and a kind of stillness she was not able to give it here. What it was a compression. All of the feeling forced into a space so small and dense that it changed the character of everything around it. She felt herself go somewhere she had been before after Morova, in the hours and days that followed, when she had functioned in a state of perfect mechanical efficiency because the alternative was to stop functioning entirely. Her shots became, in the 40 minutes that followed, something that the men who witnessed them would describe afterward in terms that embarrassed them slightly, because the words they reached for were the words of mythology rather than military reportage. She did not miss, not once. She acquired targets with a speed and certainty that seemed to operate outside the normal parameters of human reaction time, and she put them down with a precision that felt less like shooting and more like a very quiet, very final form of refusal. The enemy advance stalled, and then it stopped, and then, incrementally, it began to pull back, not in rout, but with the careful, disorganized retreat of a force that has encountered something it cannot categorize and has decided to reassess before continuing. On the frequency that Elena's interceptor was still partially monitoring, she heard a transmission, not the full content, but enough. The woman on the ridge, and then a command voice saying something she did not hear completely, and then, clearly, "Take her alive." She moved to a new position. She had 9 rounds left. The blizzard came in from the northwest in the hour before midnight, not gradually but all at once, the way mountain weather announces itself, with a wind that went from 20 kilometers per hour to 60 in under 3 minutes and a snowfall that went from flurries to zero visibility with equal abruptness. The ridge became a different world. The lights below were swallowed. Sound became unreliable, bent, and scattered by the wind. Elena moved along the eastern lip of the ridge to check the position of the remaining defenders, and found 3 of them: Gutierrez, Rourke, and a man named Ferris, who had been silent throughout and who had proven, in the course of the engagements, to be exactly as competent as his silence suggested. The others were down or gone or holding positions she could not currently reach. She told the 3 of them to hold the medical station approach and not to move from it regardless of what they heard from her direction. The special operations team that came for her was good, better than the infantry units that had made the assaults. There were 5 of them, and they moved through the blizzard with equipment that compensated partially for the zero visibility conditions, thermal imaging and communication devices that coordinated their positions in real time. Elena knew they were there before she saw them because she had been watching for exactly this, the particular way that trained hunters moved through terrain, the small tells that distinguished purposeful stealth from ordinary movement. She went still and let them pass her. And then she was behind them. She had 7 rounds. She used them with an economy that would have seemed inhuman to anyone watching, not rapid fire but spaced, deliberate, with intervals that allowed her to confirm each result before proceeding to the next. 2 of the 5 went down before they understood where she was. A third made it to cover and she left him there and moved. Changed elevation by climbing a rock face she should not have been able to climb with a wounded shoulder, and took the 4th from above. The 5th, the team leader, she could tell by his equipment configuration, was good enough to track her movement pattern and anticipate her next position. She was not quite where he anticipated. 1 round remained when it was finished. She was bleeding again. The suture from the night before had not survived the rock climb. She pressed snow against the wound and moved, because moving was the only thing that was currently available to her. She moved along the eastern ridge toward the medical station. Her vision was narrowing at the edges in a way she recognized as blood loss, and she made the calculations with the same flat clarity she had applied to everything else. How far? How fast? What was between her position and the destination? What she could do if she got there, and what she could not do if she did not. She moved. She saw the medical station from 300 meters out. She also saw, at the same moment, the secondary enemy element that had used the blizzard as cover to push along the valley floor and approach the station from the undefended south. They had not yet cleared the final rise that separated them from the hollow where the wounded were. She had 1 round. She stopped and lay down in the snow, and the world was very clear in the scope despite her narrowing vision, the particular clarity that comes sometimes at the extreme edges of the body's resources, a final sharpening before the drop. She breathed, she measured, she fired. The advance element stopped. Without their point man, in zero visibility, in terrain they did not know, they stopped and went to ground and waited. In the time it took them to reassess, Gutierrez and Rourke, who had heard the shot from their positions, moved to the southern approach and established a line that the enemy element, still recalibrating, would not push through without a fight they had not planned for. And in the darkness to the east, where the first light of the next day was still hours away, the sound of rotors became audible even above the wind. Elena heard them from the ground, lying on her back in the snow where she had fallen after the shot, her rifle still in her hands, looking up at the black sky where the blizzard was doing what blizzards do and caring nothing for the events of the night. The rotors grew louder. She let go of consciousness, the way you let go of something you have been holding too long, not dropping it, but releasing it, deliberately, because you have determined that the holding is done. She came back in a white room that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, the particular institutional white of a military medical facility, and the particular sounds of that environment. The soft percussion of monitors, the low conversation of staff in the corridor, the distant mechanical sounds of a facility that did not stop. Elena lay still and oriented herself before opening her eyes fully, the same sequencing she used when coming into a new position. Assess the environment before announcing your presence in it. She was alive. Her shoulder had been repaired. She could feel the specific numbness of effective post-operative analgesia. She had been intubated at some point and her throat was dry in the way that meant recent extubation. She had no immediate information about how long she had been unconscious or what the current status of the operation was. Her first coherent thought was that the ridge had fallen. That was the logical outcome. She had left the position. The remaining defenders were too few. The enemy had resources she had not fully depleted. She had done what was possible, and what was possible had not been enough. She lay with that thought for a moment, looking at the ceiling, and did not experience it as catastrophic. She had known, going into the 3rd night, that the arithmetic was not in her favor. She had made her choices with that knowledge and did not regret them. The wounded in the hollow were what mattered. If some of them had survived, that was sufficient. What she was not prepared for was Ray Gutierrez sitting in the chair beside her bed, looking like a man who had slept approximately none of the hours available to him, and was still awake entirely on the merits of the thing he had to say. He leaned forward when her eyes opened and said, without preamble, "The ridge held." She looked at him. He said, Reinforcements came through the western approach 6 hours after the helicopters extracted the medical station. The enemy had pulled back to regroup after the third assault. When reinforcement arrived, there was no organized resistance remaining on the eastern approach. She processed this. "The wounded," she said. He said, 63. All of them made it out. She looked back at the ceiling. She did not say anything for a long time. The information came to her in pieces over the following days, as she recovered, and the story of the ridge circulated through the channels that military stories travel, the official reports, the informal accounts that moved between units, the fragments that soldiers shared with one another in the particular shorthand of people who had been in the same landscape if not the same position. The enemy command assessment, captured in intercepted communications, had estimated that the eastern ridge was defended throughout the third assault by a force of no fewer than 40 combatants operating in a coordinated network of positions. The assessment cited exceptional tactical discipline and multi-point sniper coordination as the primary factor in the failure of 3 successive assault waves. The actual number of people who had been functional defensive operators at any given point during the third assault was, depending on how you counted it, somewhere between 1 and 4. Devon Marsh did not visit. He had been evacuated after the first assault with an injury that was serious enough to take him off the board, and by the time Elena was awake and receiving visitors, he was in a different facility. But he sent a message through the unit's administrative channel, not a long one, not a dramatic one. It said, "I was wrong about a lot of things. I'm not sure how to fix that. I'm starting here." She read it once and did not respond to it. Not because she was angry, but because some reckonings are private things that happen inside people, and the correct response to someone else's reckoning is to let it occur without commentary. Tommy Rourke came on the third day. He was in a sling, a fragment wound to the forearm, non-critical, and he was carrying something in his other hand. He sat down in the chair that Gutierrez had been occupying and held out the rifle round with the name Grace on the casing. "Burke asked me to return it," Rourke said. "He said you'd know what to say to his daughter about it better than he would." Elena looked at the round. She took it. She said, "How is he?" Rourke said, "He's going to be okay. It'll take time." She nodded. She held the round in her closed hand and said nothing else for a moment, and then she said, "Tell him she can keep it. Tell him her father was the calmest man on the ridge." Rourke wrote that down, carefully, on the back of a piece of paper. He was quiet for a moment after he had written it, and then he said, "I'm sorry for what I said before we went up." She looked at him, this young man with his wide, absorbing eyes and his arm in a sling, and his genuine effort to understand the distance between who he had been a week ago and who he was trying to become. "I know," she said. It was enough. The citation came through official channels 3 weeks after the medical discharge. It was thorough and specific and used language that citations use, language engineered to be precise about facts and careful about feeling, because the official record is not a place for feeling. What it documented was a sequence of defensive actions over a period of approximately 31 hours in which a single sniper had neutralized the offensive capacity of 3 successive assault waves, eliminated a specialized pursuit team, and maintained a defensive posture that had preserved the lives of 63 non-ambulatory casualties and their medical staff. It listed the specific engagements in chronological order. It cited the rounds expended and the targets confirmed. It mentioned the shoulder wound, its nature, and the point at which it had been sustained in a single factual sentence. It did not attempt to describe what it had meant for a person to continue operating under those conditions after sustaining that wound. Some things the official record does not have the language for. Marcus Hale came to see her once, in the last week before she was discharged. He came at a time when she was alone in the room, which she suspected was deliberate, that he had timed the visit to avoid an audience. He was not a man who would have found it easy to say what he came to say in front of other people. He sat in the chair and looked at his hands for a moment and then said, "I told you that you couldn't hold that ridge alone." She said, "Yes." He said, "I was wrong about that." She said, "Yes." He looked at her and she looked back at him, and he nodded once, that particular nod that serves as the close of a conversation in which everything necessary has been said and nothing else would improve on it. He stood up, and at the door he stopped, and he said, without turning around, "Good work, Sergeant." Then he left. Elena looked at the ceiling for a while after he was gone. She did not feel vindicated, exactly. She felt something quieter than that, the particular stillness of a thing that has resolved, not triumphantly but completely. The memorial was held on the ridge itself, in the spring, when the snow had pulled back enough from the rock to make standing there possible. A small group gathered the survivors of the unit, some officers, a few civilians who had traveled from the families of those who had not come back. The ridge had been retaken and held by conventional forces in the months following the initial defense, and the front had moved far enough east that the site was no longer contested terrain. It was simply a high, cold place, with rock and sky, and the distant sound of the wind that came down from the upper passes with the same long, low grief as it had in November. The memorial marker listed names. Michael Dean's name was on it, and 5 others. Elena stood a few steps apart from the main group during the ceremony, the way she had always done, not alienated from it, but also not seeking the comfort of proximity. She held the rifle round with grace on the casing in her closed hand throughout. Afterward, when the others had begun to move back toward the vehicles, she remained. She stood at the eastern lip of the ridge and looked down into the valley that had been, for 31 hours, the direction from which everything was coming. The valley looked different in spring green at its lowest points, still brown and gray at the elevations, with the shapes of the approach tracks still visible if you knew what you were looking at. She could trace the line of the first assault from here, and the second, and the arc of the third. She could see, from this vantage, exactly how untenable the position had been and exactly how it had been held anyway. The specific geography of the impossible thing. The enemy had later confirmed, in post-engagement analysis, that their forward command had issued a standing order for the capture of the female sniper on the eastern ridge, an order that had been in effect from the close of the second assault until the final withdrawal. The order had been based on their assessment that the defensive coordination they were encountering was the product of a senior officer with considerable experience and authority, managing multiple teams. They had never corrected the assumption that there were multiple people. The truth that for the longest stretches of the engagement, it had been one woman, one rifle, a dwindling count of rounds, and the absolute refusal to leave had not fit comfortably into their intelligence framework, and so they had not placed it there. She knelt and set the rifle round down in the snow at the edge of the rock, not the last round she had fired, which was somewhere in the valley below in a place she could not identify, but the round Burke had given her, the one she had carried through the final hours in her breast pocket beside the photograph of 8 people standing in front of a vehicle in a gray landscape. She set it down gently, and she looked at it for a moment. Then she stood and turned and walked back toward the vehicles. The wind came down from the upper passes behind her and moved the snow in patterns across the rock face. And in a few minutes the round was no longer visible. The ridge was quiet. It had the quality of a place that does not need to announce what happened there because it is still, in the stone and the cold and the particular thinness of the air, the place where it happened. They had said she could not hold that position alone. They had said it before the first shot was fired, and they had organized their assumptions around the certainty of it, and they had sent her up anyway, perhaps because they needed her, and doubted her simultaneously, the way people sometimes do with things they do not fully understand. And she had held it, not because she was without fear, and not because she was without cost, and not because the arithmetic had ever resolved in her favor. She had held it because the alternative was to leave, and leaving meant something specific and irreversible for 63 people in a hollow 50 meters behind the defensive line, and that was not a calculation she could complete in a way that ended with her moving toward the vehicles while they remained behind. That was the whole of it. That was the decision, made before the first assault began and not reconsidered afterward. She would not leave. History does not always record the things that matter most about a moment. It records confirmed kills and rounds expended and hours held and citations awarded and the official language of what happened. What it cannot record what exists only in the memory of those who were there and, imperfectly, in the accounts they give is the quality of a person who does not quit when quitting, is both available and rational, and when everyone around her has reason to expect it. What it cannot record is the thing that holds the line when the line should not be holdable. What it cannot record is the exact texture of a decision made alone, in the cold, in the dark, in the full knowledge of what it costs. The ridge was held. The wounded came home. The enemy commander never got the woman on the ridge, and in the spring, when the snow pulled back, the rock showed exactly what rock shows when you look at it long enough, that some things do not move, that some things hold, that a position is not a place, it is a choice. And the choice had been made, and it had not been abandoned.